Hey everyone, welcome to podcast number 17, World War II. So today we'll be covering isolationism to neutrality, Pearl Harbor, battles of World War II, home front, and discrimination during the war. So let's get moving here. All right. The 1920s and 1930s, the foreign policy of the United States takes a major shift towards isolationism. Okay, we left off talking when we were talking about World War I. We talked about Woodrow Wilson's failed idealism, how he wanted to create this international organization known as the League of Nations to prevent foreign wars. But the Republicans were able to defeat that in the Senate, and that kind of dies. Okay, the 1920s then becomes the decade of Republican presidents, and those guys shift to policies of isolationism. On top of that, obviously, in the 1930s, we have the Great Depression, so most of our, we're obviously focusing a lot on that, okay? But during the 20s and the 30s, you can basically see all the things that we do kind of signal that we're not really interested in getting involved in world affairs, okay? Washington Conference, 1921-1922, and the Five-Power Naval Treaty, we attempt to move away from large navies, so we're trying to get to this point where everyone has small militaries, because small militaries is going to mean small chance of war. We're not going to join the League of Nations, which I already mentioned. We're going to pass the ridiculous Kellogg-Briand Act of 1928, which is going to outlaw war. And wouldn't that be great if you could just pass legislation to outlaw war? Anyways, there's going to be an issue with the war debt policy, which means that the Europeans wanted us to forgive their debt from World War I, and we are going to insist that they pay that debt back. And that's going to turn out to be a colossal mistake, because by insisting that the French and British pay us back, they're going to insist the Germans pay them back for reparations. That's going to create hyperinflation in Germany. That's going to create a very desperate situation in the German political system. And we all know what happens there. Hitler and the Nazis are going to step in and promise the world to the German people and assume power. Okay, and had we not made them pay back those debts, maybe things would have turned out differently. Who knows? So anyways, we also try to have a nicer policy for Latin America. FDR in the 30s proclaimed that the U.S. would stop intervening in Latin America. Okay, continuing on with FDR and his foreign policy, FDR signals to the rest of the world in the London Conference that he's really not interested in improving global trade. He doesn't really want to do what the Europeans want him to do. He wants to follow his own fiscal policies, or economic policies, I should say. So he kind of walks away from the London Conference, which I think was a mistake. The Tidings-McDuffie Act, 1934, basically signals to the world that we're going to get out of Southwest Pacific Ocean with giving the Filipinos their independence within a decade or so. And like I said, with the good neighbor policy, is we're going to stop intervening. So basically all of these things are kind of signaling that we're not really interested in being that world leader that we thought we wanted to be back in the early 20th century. We're kind of moving away from all of that. We're kind of like coming into our shell here and kind of ignoring what's going on in the rest of the world. Okay. However, though, it becomes clear to FDR, once Hitler comes to power, once Mussolini gets super aggressive, it becomes clear to the president that we might have to step in eventually. Okay, but FDR is a smart politician, so he knows that he needs the American people to support him. Okay, and so what you're going to see with these Neutrality Acts is that slowly but surely, the Neutrality Acts are going to get us closer and closer and closer to just outright supporting the Allies. Okay. So let's look at the first set of Neutrality Acts. We have the Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, and 37. So all this stuff is getting passed when the Italians are invading Ethiopia, when the Japanese have invaded China. Okay, and so basically what the Neutrality Acts say is that whenever the president acknowledges a foreign war, no business can be done with any of the nations. Okay, even the innocent nations. And so basically the thought process is that in World War I, we were selling stuff to both sides, mainly the Allies, but we were selling stuff to both sides. And because of that, American ships got sunk, American lives got lost, and eventually we were pulled into this conflict that we really had nothing to do with. So basically the thought process, and I keep saying thought process, sorry about that, the idea is that if we don't do that, we're not going to be pulled into any kind of foreign wars. Okay, so those are what the Neutrality Acts are kind of all about. FDR continues this policy of neutrality, giving his quarantine speech And this was his response to Japanese and Italian aggression. It's one of his more famous foreign policy speeches. And basically he says that whenever we see these aggressor nations, we're just going to stop interacting with them. We're just going to place embargoes on them, and we won't have any dealings with them at all. Okay? However, by 1939, when Hitler does declare war, it's clear that we're getting to this point where we have to help the Allies out. Okay, I mean, FDR clearly is not going to side with Hitler. He's going to support the British and the French. And so we're going to want to try to find ways to help out our allies, even though we're not calling them allies at this point. So the Neutrality Act in 1939 is going to, I guess, kind of give in to FDR a little bit. It's going to say, okay, we're going to give you weapons, and we're going to sell you some stuff. But here's the deal. It's called the cash and carry policy, saying that if you want to buy U.S. munitions, U.S. war supplies, that's fine, but you pay us cash. We're not going to borrow money to you like in World War I, and we're not going to carry the supplies over to you also like in World War I. Okay, so we're not going to have you borrow money from us, and we're not going to have our ships sunk. So if you want to come over here and get them, get our stuff, and pay us for it, that's fine. Okay, and that's kind of the initial policy. That's kind of how we start to get involved a little bit with the Allies during World War I. Or World War II, excuse me. Okay, interesting stat here. At this point, 1939, so when World War II does start, only 2.5% of Americans actually support entering the conflict. Okay, but anyways, as the Allies start fighting the Germans and the Axis powers, they start buying more stuff from us, which is going to help pull us out of the Great Depression. Okay, by 1940, it is clear that the British are in really tough shape. The French, as many of you might know, fall pretty quickly to the German blitzkrieg, and they're out of the war. And so basically it's Germany versus the British, okay? And so FDR is going to do what he can to help. The British are in desperate need for supplies and weapons. And so one of the deals that FDR makes with the British is this destroyers for bases deal, which means that basically we're going to give the British 50 destroyers, which are obviously ships, to fight the German U-boats. And in return, we're going to get to use British bases in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, now this is a major violation of neutrality, but FDR doesn't think so. Now, also during this time, we have what's known as the American First Committee. Okay, this is a group of around 800,000 Americans that are strict isolationists that don't want us to get involved at all with this war. They feel like we shouldn't waste our time helping Europe, that if Hitler's for real, we should basically start defending the United States, make Fortress America, and be able to defend ourselves, and let the Europeans kind of, deal with it on their own. Anyways, it's one of my favorite political cartoons to the right there, by the very famous Dr. Seuss, by the way. Okay, moving on. FDR, though, knows that a war is coming, so he starts preparing for one. He institutes a peacetime draft in 1940, which basically means that we're going to start drafting 1.2 million troops and 800 reservists every single year and get them ready to fight. So America, even though we're not at war, FDR gets us ready for war. Okay. Later on in 1940, FDR wins an unprecedented third term. First time a president's ever done that. So he breaks the precedent that George Washington set. And it's becoming very clear that the British need more help, because now, with the cash and carry policy, the British have literally run out of money. And so they don't have any more money to buy needed supplies from us. And if we don't give them these supplies, they're going to collapse. And so FDR basically pushes through the Lend-Lease Act of 1940, which basically means that we are going to be the great arsenal of democracy. We're going to, quote-unquote, lend material to the British because their defense is vital to the U.S. Okay, and he uses his very famous fire hose analogy, saying that, if your neighbor's house is on fire, aren't you going to go run over there and lend him your hose to help put out his fire? And so FDR is saying we're just being neighborly, we're helping out a fellow democracy. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's very much a hotly debated topic at this time. It's not just kind of a quick, easy pass through Congress. It definitely has some bumps along the way. The map in the lower left there shows you where we send all of our money. And so basically you can see the United States is kind of propping up all of our allies, whether it's the British, whether it's Russia. We're sending all this money, all of these supplies over to help out our allies. Okay. In 1941, many people don't know this, but in 1941, though, it's pretty clear that we're very close to being at war with the Germans. In fact, there's actually an unofficial war that pops up between the United States Navy and the German Navy in 1941. FDR instructs the U.S. Navy to engage German U-boats on site. So even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy and the German U-boats are actually attacking one another. Okay, Churchill, the leader of the British, meets with FDR, and they sign what's known as the Atlantic Charter, where FDR basically pledges that the U.S. will enter the war, and they talk about what they want to see the post-war world look like, where you have, collective security, disarmament, self-determination, freedom of the seas, all that good stuff. Okay, but before we can actually go to war with Germany, something kind of happens, and we all know what that something is. Pearl Harbor gets attacked by the Japanese on December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy. Our Navy is decimated by the Japanese attack. However, they didn't sink our aircraft carriers, which was incredibly important because those were our most important ships. And the fact that those ships did not get sunk allowed us to kind of hang around until we're able to resupply our Pacific fleet and start pushing the Japanese back. Okay? So anyways, I'm not going to talk a lot about battles because that's not really a point of emphasis on the test. So I'm just going to real quickly highlight what the Americans did in World War II. Okay? So Battle of the Atlantic is a major battle. It takes place throughout most of the war, and this basically refers to the battle between the Allied navies and the German U-boats. Okay, because we need to supply the British with supplies, and we also need to move our troops and supplies over to Europe. And so before we do that, we have to take out the U-boats, which we successfully do. 1942, 1943, the British and the Americans open up what they consider to be a second front. They invade North Africa, and it is there that the German army is kind of thrown out of North Africa during those 2 years, 1942 and 1943. Okay, the next target for the British and the Americans is Italy. Churchill insists the best way to get to Germany is through the soft underbelly of Europe, and so the plan is to go through Italy and then invade Germany from the south. Stalin's not going to like that. Stalin wants the second front opened up in France because the Soviets are obviously suffering quite a bit because of the German invasion of their nation. Okay, the invasion of Italy doesn't really go that well. The Germans are able to defend the peninsula pretty successfully throughout the war, and the Allies definitely have to find a new way to get to Germany, and they find that way through France. And so on D-Day, 1944, the Americans, British, and the Canadians invade France and begin the process of liberating it. The Battle of the Bulge is the last major battle that is fought in World War II. That is where Hitler launches a kind of last-ditch offensive at the Allied lines and tries to push the British and American armies into the sea. They're somewhat successful at first, but the Americans are able to hold the line, and the Germans exhaust themselves. And after that, the Germans are essentially defeated, and it's just a matter of marching to Berlin. Okay, and that's how the war ends, obviously. In the Pacific theater, also some important battles for us to mention. We have the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is the first time that and that's in 1942, by the way. I didn't put the years on there. Sorry about that. That's when it's the first time the Japanese advance is halted. They were attempting to move towards Australia. The U.S. Aircraft carriers were able to stop them. Battle of Midway is probably the turning point of the Pacific theaters. One of the most important battles fought in that part of the war. The Battle of Midway is where we ambush a Japanese attack and sink 4 of their aircraft carriers. After that, the Americans employ what's known as an island hopping strategy, which is where we take strategic islands that get us closer and closer to Japan so that we can bomb them. And then within that strategy, we have 2 super important battles known as the Battle of Iwo Jima, where we take a very, very important island, an island that's very close to Japan that will serve as a great air base for our planes. And then also the Battle of Okinawa, which is considered a home island where Japanese civilians actually lived, and it was there that we encountered fanatical defense from the Japanese. They even used kamikaze pilots to resist the Americans. But after these two islands are taken and other islands in the area, the American bombers can just basically bomb Japan with very little resistance. Okay, the Japanese are very tough people though, and they're not willing to give up. And so President Truman, who is now taken over from FDR, who is now dead, drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those atomic bombs were developed throughout the Manhattan Project, top secret project to develop those bombs, and they were dropped by the plane, the Enola Gay. Okay. As far as the home front goes, you're going to see a lot of similarities between World War II and World War I. The government very much gets involved to make sure that all of our wartime needs are met. Okay, so it's very much a battle of the smokestacks here. Okay, we have a wartime economy. Automobile plants make tanks, planes, and jeeps. Textile factories make uniforms. Shipyards build ships for our Navy and our merchant Navy to get supplies over to Europe. Okay, war orders are just flowing through, and it's just jacking our economy up. Everything's going good. Farmers are having record harvests, and so one of the great things, and it's hard to say great things, but one of the great things about World War II for us is that it definitely pulls us out of the Great Depression. So this is this thing that we've been stuck in for a decade. It pulls us out. Okay, it should also be noted that during the war, we had a war labor board that basically did not allow strikes to happen. You have the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act, which meant the government could seize businesses if strikes stopped production. So basically, we didn't want any kind of labor disruption. We wanted to make sure the supplies kept on coming to make sure that the war effort went impeded. Okay. As far as paying for the war goes, we basically pay for the war in two ways. Number one, we raised taxes. And number two, we borrowed money, and so we went back to getting those, victory bonds, Liberty bonds, what have you, and that's how we got most of the money. But we definitely went into a lot of debt to fight this war. In fact, if you were to compare the debt to the GDP of the nation, GDP being the size of the economy, it's the most in debt we've ever been. Okay, so that's interesting. Mobilizing America's manpower. America gets around 15 million people to serve in the armed forces throughout World War II. We rely a lot on women, also women in the military, and also women at home. 6 million women leave the homes to work in the factories. Rosie the Riveter is one of the more famous propaganda posters from the era, trying to get women all pumped up about working in the factories. Okay. Other important things taking place during World War II on the home front is we see some major demographic changes taking place. We have certain cities that become almost like boom towns because of the war industries that they have, like Detroit, Seattle, and LA. FDR takes this time to help out some of the poorer regions of the country. He disproportionately spends money in the South to encourage growth, which he also might have done to secure some political advantages, perhaps. Once a politician, always a politician. And we also see kind of the beginnings of the civil rights movement starting up here with the WWII campaign, with African Americans saying we should go for victory in war and victory in race relations. 1.6 million African Americans leave the South and move to the North to work in the factories, so it's a major realignment of African Americans within our country. Obviously, many of the African Americans lived in the South, but it was during really World War I, World War II, where we see this really big movement of African Americans out of those southern states. And for really the first time, guys, with African Americans spreading throughout the country, race relations becomes not a regional issue, but it becomes a national issue, because when African Americans move north into cities like Chicago or even Milwaukee, Detroit, stuff like that, there's going to be a lot of race conflicts because a lot of these northern whites are not used to living around African Americans. It's important to note that there's a lot of racism in the north, not just the south, and there's going to be a lot of conflicts throughout the 40s, 50s, and the 60s as we see this demographic shift taking place. Okay. Also, it's important to note that a lot of civil liberties were taken away during World War II. Japanese Americans were treated very poorly during this war. FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which ordered Japanese Americans into internment camps. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court even ruled that that was constitutional because the U.S. was at war, and sometimes drastic measures have to be taken. And so you see a picture here of all these Japanese American civilians, sitting in these internment camps. So that's obviously not a bright spot for the United States during World War II. I believe it was in the 1990s or maybe 1980s where the United States officially apologized for that and reimbursed the survivors or the descendants of the people that were put in these camps. So anyways, kind of a long one there, sorry about that. But feel free to follow me on Twitter, ask me any questions. My website's there with all my chapter PowerPoints as well as my podcast. Email me any questions, and that's my YouTube channel. Thanks, guys. Hope this helps.